I need to start. There we go.
Well, good evening, good afternoon. We'll get started in a few minutes. Hey, welcome everyone. We'll get started in a minute or so to allow other people to come in. Thank you for joining us today. Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Carla Pineda, and I'm LACLA's Deputy Director. I also want to thank our team for being here today and everyone who's with us. I also want to say thank you to our co-sponsors, our sister organizations, CLUE, the Coalition for Labor Union Women, and Pride at Work. As you know, the upcoming election is extremely important, not just for ourselves, but for our families and our community. And we have to work together to ensure that every voter can cast a ballot on November 5th. One of the ways we can do this is by informing ourselves and helping others to vote and to learn more about ID requirements in your state. So this is the reason why we have this webinar today. But before we get started, I want to pass it on to Bridget Nakamura. She's LACLA's Chapter Development and Field Coordinator. Bridget's going to go over a few housekeeping rules. So go ahead, Bridget.
Great. Hi. Thank you, Carla. Yeah, so like Carla said, I'm the chapter field coordinator for LACLA, and I just wanted to do some housekeeping. So, si necesitan discusión en español, I'll click in El Mundo y selección Español. For code of conduct, LACLA is committed to providing an environment free from discrimination and harassment. We ask all participants to embrace our value, equity, and equality, and connect themselves in this meeting consists with those values. Anyone who thinks they have experienced discriminatory, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior, we urge you to contact Carla Pineda via email at kpineda@lacla.org. Please note that the code of conduct applies to all meetings LACLA hosts, including meetings or calls held via Zoom or other software, and including both discussions and chat. Q&A will be at the end of the presentation, so you can drop your questions in the Q&A section below, and we'll get to it at the end. And thank you guys for coming.
Gracias, Bridget. De nuevo, si alguien necesita interpretación en español, por favor, presione el mundo abajo de su pantalla y seleccione la opción español para interpretación. And now I want to introduce our speaker, Selene Gomez. Selene is the National Outreach Director for VoteRiders. Selene, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your time and for giving us all this valuable information. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So as Carla mentioned, hi everyone, I'm Selene Gomez. I'm the National Outreach Director for VoteRiders. And today I'm going to be talking to you about voter ID. Carla mentioned that, there's elections coming up and they're very crucial. But in a lot of states, it's not enough to just register to vote. Voter ID laws have been exploding in the most recent years. And so I'm here to talk to you about that today, so you can be aware of it, but then also what you can do about it. So in this next slide here, you will go ahead and see just a little bit of giving you a little bit of context before we get started. Just so you know, VoteRiders is a national nonpartisan organization. We were founded in 2012. This happened after there was a wave of Republicans who actually started passing voter ID laws on the state level. And I say this because that's not partisan, that's just facts, right? That is what was happening. And so because of that, we started seeing that there weren't many organizations that actually address voter ID. A lot of great organizations were doing voter registration, we're doing, get out the vote, we're doing education, but not necessarily on this aspect. And so that is when VoteRiders came around. And so for us, we're, committed to ensuring that every eligible US citizen is able to exercise their freedom to vote and cast a ballot that counts. So next slide, please. So, part of the key to our success is the fact that we use partners. We use people that are already trusted in communities to talk about this. So we work with a diverse range of partners, from direct service providers like food pantries, like nonprofit clinics, community centers, to democracy organizations, to organizations that focus on labor, on different issues. And so since the inception of VoteRiders of 2012, we've worked with over 2,000 partners, again, because we know that these organizations, especially grassroots organizations, are already trusted entities. And so we want to make sure that people take advantage of the resources that we provide. And so that's how we are able to really expand our footprint and to really be able to reach to as many voters, oftentimes the most vulnerable voters, honestly, to be able to get not only know about the voter ID law in their state, but actually obtain an ID that is accepted to vote. Next slide. So we do have some buckets here of our program areas. We do voter ID education, we do voter ID assistance, so actually helping obtain documentation you may need to go get your state ID. We do communications and digital campaigns, and then also policy and narrative change with this, especially, during lunch sessions and things like that, when there's a state that needs a little bit more information or needs guidance as to how we've seen other voter ID laws play out in other states, we're able to not only provide the expertise in that aspect, but then also often what we see is what a policy is and the implications that it comes on the ground. Next slide. So while we are a national organization, and we do work in the 38 out of 50 states that have a voter ID law for all our programming, we do work on voter ID education and outreach for all 50 states. However, these 8 states here is where we actually have at least 2 people on the ground. So if you're in any of these 2 states, yes, we can offer the resources and we can offer them even if your state isn't on this slide. But if it is, then you would be able to potentially even work with our individuals on the ground for 2024. Next slide. So why should we care about voter ID? I'm just going to share a little bit of background and information that you may find helpful, and will urge you to address, voter ID when it comes to your community and making sure that they're casting a ballot that counts. So unfortunately, we've seen that the barriers to the ballot are growing. voter ID has definitely changed dramatically since the last presidential elections. We've seen an explosion of voter ID laws. So we've seen at least 18 states that have either implemented a more strict voter ID law since the last presidential election, or a state that didn't have a voter ID law now has one. So this is really important because a lot of people that voted in the last presidential election may not be able to cast a regular ballot if they do the same thing in that state that has changed their voter ID laws. And so this is important because the voters that tend to vote every 4 years for the big elections may not be the most informed when it comes to, what it is that you may have to take. This is going to contribute to voter confusion. If there's voter confusion, some people may not even show up at the polls, even if they do have the right identification. And so we definitely want to prevent that. Next slide. So in addition to this, we actually did a study in 2023, late last year. We did it with the Center of Democracy and Civic Engagement from the University of Maryland and also the Brennan Center for Justice. Mind you, before this, the only study that really kind of talked about voter ID was from 2006 from the Brennan Center for Justice, but there was no representative sample for the Latino voters. There wasn't a voting block. So now, it's unimaginable. You can't talk about voting and not talk about the Latino vote because it is the second biggest voting block nationwide. And so for us, we really wanted to make sure that we captured that. So last year we did a representative sample of US adult citizen populations, individuals that are eligible to vote. And we did do an oversample of youth, which was from 18 to 24-year-olds, and an oversample of Black Latino respondents as well. And so the numbers that I'm about to share with you, just keep in mind, are part of the 2020 census, the most recent decennial survey that we had here. So some of the findings here is the big one is that almost 15% of voting age US citizens don't have an unexpired driver's license or state ID with a current name or address on it. That translates to over 34.5 million people. This is very important because depending on what state you live in, you may not be able to use an ID or driver's license if it's expired, and others you may, or your name and or address may have to significantly be similar when it comes to the name or have your current address on it. So this means that about 15% of eligible voters would have issues because they may not have all of the correct or most current information on their identification that they're trying to use. Next slide. We also know, unfortunately, it's no surprise, but there is an equal impact, right? Some people are more affected than others. We know that Black and Latinx individuals are more impacted and are less likely to have a current driver's license or ID. We also know that individuals that don't have a high school diploma or college degree are less likely to have an ID, and people with lower incomes as well. One thing that we do highlight is that out of all the demographics, all the different subgroups, we found that young Black Americans are the least likely to have a driver's license with their current name or address on it. So you're talking about 18 to 29-year-olds. And actually, when you break it down, the ones that are really less likely to have it are 18 and 19-year-olds. So out of that population, 30% of them, they just didn't have one, right? Which means it's 70%. Out of that 70%, almost half did not have it with a current name or address. So when it comes to this, we're starting to see that it's really important to get BIPOC youth to get their ID. Yes, it's great if we go to college campuses, but if we can get them sooner, that's even better because not everybody's going to go to a college campus. Or if you do, if you're a commuter, for example, in a community college, you're not necessarily going to be there asking for resources. You kind of go to class and come back. And so this has really geared and guided us on the work that we are trying to do to try to get to youth as soon as possible. Next slide. We also found that about 1/5 of respondents that didn't have a driver's license, they said that they didn't have it because of a bureaucratic or economic factor as to why they weren't able to get it. So this could include having financial or legal difficulties like unpaid tickets or fines. They don't have the time, or they don't have the documents that they need to be able to get one of these identifications. Next slide. And also about 20% of individuals that are living in states that have a voter ID law don't have a current driver's license. So if you live in a state that does not have, that has a voter ID law, sorry, about 20% of these individuals are not going to have a current driver's license. Next slide. And it's not just about not having the identification, it's also about the confusion. For, you know, like I said in the beginning, right? The not knowing may not even get you out the door to go to the polls. And so that's very important. More than half of the US citizens living in the states where photo ID is required to vote don't know their voter ID law for their state. Or they don't know what specific ID they have to take to be able to cast a regular ballot. We also found that it's unfortunately similar also in states where you don't require a photo ID. There's still a lot of confusion. A lot of people, we do have a helpline and people will call and say, hey, what ID do I need to take? Because there's been so much talk about this that sometimes people think that it's a federal law when in fact it's state by state basis. And so for us, the outreach and education is really important because we're seeing that even if people have it, it still might not be enough, because if you have that doubt, instead of going to the polls and risking being, you know, denied, some people may just choose not to go altogether. Next slide. Now, in this map, you'll see that it's color-coded. The states that are in white are the states that don't have a voter ID law. So if you live in this state, you don't have to worry about a voter ID law. However, there is the Helping Americans Vote Act, where individuals that may be voting for the first time might be asked for identity, proof of identity. However, this only happens the first time that they vote, and after that, they should not be asked for an identification. This is a federal thing. Now, the states that are in the dark purple are states that have a voter ID law, but have not changed since the last presidential election. And the ones in that salmonish color, it's either states that have a new voter ID law, or they had one and it became more strict within the last 3 to 4 years. As you can see, 38 states have the voter ID laws in place. 18 have passed stricter or new laws since 2020. So this is how it's impacting over 34.5 million voting age US citizens. Next slide. So what can you do about it? Enough of the doom and gloom and just talking about the issue. What is it that you can do about it as an organization, as an individual? What are resources that you have out there? Well, the first one that I'm going to talk about is our voter ID state information pages. If you go to our homepage, which is voteriders.org, you are going to be greeted with a color-coded map, similar to the one that you saw in the last couple slides, but it's different shades of purple. There, you click on your state, and then it takes you to your state page. There, you're going to get any information that you need. For us, we prioritize just using plain language, because sometimes you may read something and it's so dense that you say, okay, so did it answer my question? And you have to reread it. So for us, we pretty much break down voter ID laws and let you know, okay, these are the IDs that you can take if you're voting in person or if you're voting by mail, because there could be different ID requirements for that. If there's any alternatives, instead of, you know, if they say, okay, if you don't have a list of any of the ones from this list, then you can use secondary documentation. We provide you with that information. In some states, you sign an affidavit and you're still able to cast a regular ballot. It also provides links to request help on getting an ID. You can also download our information cards, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and it also gives you access to the state's official website. Please note that all of these state pages are fully bilingual in both English and in Spanish. In fact, all of our resources are fully bilingual in English and in Spanish. You go to the top right on our website and you can switch it into Spanish mode and you can get information there. I highly suggest that you bookmark your state page here. you know, with some organizations, when they have resource pages, for example, they link out to this. Sometimes they like to copy and paste, which is fine. But if you link out to us, you don't have the burden of having to keep checking and make sure that nothing has changed. We update our website in real time. So for us, our goal is that when a person goes and visits our website that day, they know exactly what it is they need to take to vote that day. So we won't reflect those changes. Let's say that you know, something passed. And I can tell you, for instance, it happened in Texas in September of 2022. They said they changed the voter ID requirements for voting by mail, but it would go into effect December 2nd. But we had elections in November. We didn't make those changes in our Texas page for November because we wanted to make sure that people knew what they needed to take for that election. It wasn't until December 2nd where we actually made that change, and we started informing people about that. So highly encourage you to do that. And if we go to the next slide here, you'll also see that there's a QR code where you can scan it. It'll take you to that page, or you can just go to voteriders.org/ and then the name of your state, and it'll take you right away to your state page. The next resource that we have is our voter ID information cards. You'll see that the two people here in this picture are holding it up. They're wallet size, so they're small, but they open up so they can have quite a bit more information. We have these for all 50 states plus DC. We have them both in English and in Spanish. And we actually provide these completely free of charge to nonprofits and nonpartisan organizations. We also have the digital versions of this. So if you're doing any text banks or you want to include it in an email or a newsletter, electronic newsletter, you're also able to do that. And essentially, it gives you information on the acceptable identifications, any alternatives, if any. And in this next slide, you'll see the kind of the layout. This is the Texas one, the first one. It says in Texas, you're asked to show a voter ID to vote in person. That is the cover. The middle picture is when you open it, what it is that you see. And then the last part here is the back, where it also gives you our helpline number, which people can either call us or text us to, both in English or in Spanish, if they either one, have questions, or if two, they need help in getting their identification. And then in this next slide, you'll just go ahead and see that it's the same thing. It's just in Spanish. So you can preview the Spanish version here. It is a little bit of a different orientation. As we all know, when you translate, sometimes it's a little bit longer, but we try to really leave it as similar as possible, just to be able to get the same information, the same quality of information on this. And in this next slide here, you'll see that there's a QR code where you can actually order these, or you can go to voteriders.org/cards, and you can order these, again, free of charge for nonpartisan nonprofit organizations. There's no limit to how many cards you order or how many times you order them. We've had orders of 250 cards. We've actually had orders of 100,000 cards. And as long as you have a plan to distribute them, we're more than happy to provide them to you. This is great to just have in reception areas, give to local businesses when you're doing voter registration, when you're tabling, if you are giving swag bags to any back to school events that are coming up, or welcome back to schools or anything like that, you can just provide that. And it's really handy just because if you have the physical one, people can literally put it in their wallet and then they just take it out once it's getting closer to the day that they're going to vote. And if you use the digital version, people can just save it as a picture and then pull it up once it gets closer to election day to make sure that they have what they need to vote. Next slide. We also do voter ID training. So it could be something similar like this, or if you want to have a training on your voter ID law of your state, we can definitely do that as well. And we can do these either virtually or in person. Again, if you're in one of the 8 states where we have staff, we can do that in person. These are great. For instance, if you are looking to train canvassers, text bankers, phone bankers. Also, if you just want to give, a voting 101 and you want to talk about voter ID, we can make these about an hour long, or we can make them short and sweet to the point, about 10 to 15 minutes. And then if anybody has questions, they can reach out to us. We also do joint outreach. So if you want to do co-branded material, let's say you want to do a 1-pager on just the voting process, but you want us to be able to contribute when it comes to the voter ID and list our helpline and our resources, we're more than happy to work with you on that material and co-branded. We also do virtual volunteer events. So let's say that you want to do a text bank for a state that has voter ID laws, we are more than happy to co-host an event like that with you. We also do letter writing parties where we provide you the list of the voters. You can do some specialized or personalized letters, and we can send those out to the voters. Or if you're interested in doing any other kind of virtual volunteer events, just because I haven't mentioned it doesn't mean that we're not open to it. You can definitely reach out to me, and I'll make sure to share my email address at the end of the presentation for that. Next slide. We also do the direct voter contact partnerships. So if you are doing a GOTV or you're reaching out to a certain universe of voters or you have pledge cards, if you want to talk about voter ID and you're willing to add an ID question into your script, we can work with you. And then when you identify individuals that do not have an ID to vote, then you can send us that information. We actually have staff and trained volunteers that follow up with them. We follow up with them if they say, I don't have an acceptable ID. We then transfer them to our voter ID assistance program, where we open up a case for them. And then whatever it is that they need assistance with, we go ahead and get started with that and start helping them to get their identification. Again, also the volunteer events. I know that I've talked a little bit about that, but again, these could be some closed events just with your membership, or if you want to open it, we're more than happy to do that. Next slide. We also have our voter ID helpline and chatbot. Again, if you call or text us to 866-ID-2-VOTE, you will be greeted. The first question we ask is, what language do you prefer, English or Spanish? The second question is, what state are you calling or texting us from? So we make sure we give you the right information. After that, you don't have to go through 10 prompts to get to your question. You can actually just ask your question, or you can already say, hey, I need help in getting my state ID, and we can get that going, because you're going to be chatting with a live staff member or trained volunteer. Other ways that you can also ask for help or ask questions is through voteriders.org/free help. You can also email us, or you can also chat with us on Facebook, on Messenger. You can DM us on Instagram or on our website. If you go to voteriders.org, our chat bot will pop up on the bottom right-hand corner, and you can go ahead and get started that way. Next slide. We also do voter ID assistance. So like I said, it's really important to do the outreach and education, let people know what it is that they need so they can cast a regular ballot. And they can also go to the polls with confidence, knowing that they can advocate for themselves. But in addition to that, we also help people get their identification to be able to go vote. So we cover cost of, the identification or cost of any of the underlying documents. Like, for example, if they need a certified copy of their birth certificate, not only do we help them navigate through the process so they can order it, but we cover the cost of that. And any other underlying documents that it is that you need to be able to go to the ID issuing office and to get your state ID or driver's license. We also arrange transportation to and from the ID issuing office. And in some cases, sometimes people may have really old birth certificates, or maybe there's issues. Their name is spelled a little bit different from one document to another. So if pro bono legal assistance is needed to make any amendments or to just really work through a case, we're also able to tap into our network and actually provide the voter with that pro bono legal assistance, and they don't have to pay out of pocket for any of that. Next slide. We also have voter ID clinics. So also as part of voter ID assistance, we have these clinics where if you want to open it up to people so they can already start the intake process because they need to get their state identification, we can co-host a voter ID clinic. Again, if you're in one of the 8 states where we have stuff on the ground, we can have somebody on the ground. But if we don't, we are still able to not only provide the support that you need, but be able to also do it virtually and have individuals be there virtually. This is a one-on-one assistance for voters, so they get to speak with someone directly, again, in person or virtual. And we cover all the costs associated with the ID process. And clinics can be scheduled either on a reoccurring basis. Let's say you have an office space and you say, hey, the first Monday of the month, I'd love to kind of promote like us having this service. Or if you just want to do it as a one-time thing, you kind of want to test it out, see how it goes. We are open to either or. And the virtual ID assistance, we are flexible on the days and times that you may want to get that going. Next slide. We also have our digital assets on voter ID. So we do have a social kit. If you go to voteriders.org/social, you will see that there's graphics, evergreen graphics, where you're just able to use those. And there's also some language that you can literally copy and paste and make them as social media posts. So you can create awareness and encourage people to do an ID check. For us, even though we do this for voting, and it's cyclical, we do our voter ID assistance, education, and outreach year round. And so for us, the sooner people check this, the better, because we don't like to get calls, and we get them, right? Unfortunately, people calling on election day and saying, I don't have an ID to cast a regular ballot. And sometimes we're able to get them alternatives, at least until we help them get their ID. But sometimes there aren't many alternatives, or they don't have the documentation they need to take advantage of that. So I always encourage you on social media. It's definitely something low lift where you can copy and paste. I encourage you to talk about it, especially if there is a voter ID law in your state. It's very necessary, again, not just to register, but make sure that you know what documents you have to take with you to cast a regular ballot. And to honestly have the voter be confident that they have what they need and they can advocate for themselves should they be giving any other information at the polls. But as part of this, we've also started to develop very specialized resources. For example, for trans and non-binary voters, they have additional obstacles, right? When you trying to change your gender marker, for example, there is a lengthier process to do that. And sometimes it's not as clear. It's very bureaucratic and it's very hard to kind of navigate, right? Just to give you an example, we're always updating our resources. We recently heard that in Texas, they weren't going to allow trans and non-binary individuals to change their gender markers. So now we have implemented a policy on how it is that we can help them with maybe another acceptable identification to be able to do that. So you can go to voteriders.org/pride and you can get all that information for each of the states. We also have it for student voters because we know that youth and students tend to get a little bit more hard hit when it comes to voter IDs. In some states, you can't use student IDs, even though a lot of the campuses may be polling locations, for instance. So in that website, we break down the states that accept the student IDs, and if there isn't, what it is that they can do, or if there is, making sure that students know what it is that they can take, or why their student ID is accepted or not accepted. And then we also have a page for voters with disabilities, right? Because if you're a voter with disabilities, for example, you may have additional ways that you can vote. So then the question comes of, what about the voter ID component? How does that apply or not apply to me? And so we do have guidance there on a state-by-state basis as well. One that is coming up hopefully soon is for new citizens, those individuals that need to change or get a new ID with some documentation reflecting their new status of being a U.S. citizen. So that will be coming hopefully within the next several months. And that's also going to be something that we can provide because we know that that is a population that may need a little bit more support. So then they can start going and voting. Next slide. So those are the resources that we have. You can follow us on all social media platforms. It's at VoteRiders. You can also reach us at voteriders.org/partners if you're interested in partnering with us in some way. If you have any questions, you can also email us at info@voteriders.org. But I am also going to drop my email address for any of you that may have questions just on anything that I really talked about, or if you want to have a follow-up conversation as to what it would look like in your community if you want to use some of these resources. So with that, and the last slide, I believe, is thank you. And so this is our team. Please connect with us. If you are in one of those 8 states that have our staff on the ground, we're more than happy to do it. Again, I will drop my email. you reach out to me and I can connect you with the respective staff. But even if you're not in one of those 8 states, we can definitely make something happen and either host a clinic or an event where we're able to help the voters that you are reaching out to. And now I will go ahead and if there's any questions, now is the time. And the presentation doesn't have to be shared anymore if you'd like to.
There's a question in the queue. Selena, it says, what can you do if they challenge your vote when you go to vote? I guess when you're there, if you get challenged for not having the right ID.
So this is why it's really important to know what identifications or alternatives are out there, because it's not necessarily malice, but sometimes a poll worker may have misunderstood or not necessarily know some of the protocol. So that's why I encourage you to get those cards, because if you have that, you know for a fact what it is that you need to take or what alternatives. And so you would advocate for yourself. Just because he tell you that doesn't always mean that it's right. Just to give you an example, I'm based here out of San Antonio in Texas, and there was a university that while students were using a certain identification or filling out an affidavit, they were being given provisional ballots when they should be given regular ballots. So that is the one thing. Make sure that you are prepped up and you go. Now, another thing, because I don't want to intimidate and people be like, oh, if I don't feel super prepared, I'm not going to go. I would also encourage you to take the election protection hotline or take any number with you, because if you have any issues at the polls, you can call in real time and you can speak with somebody and they can give you guidance as to what steps to take. Or what it is that you need to do there. If there's an issue that they're seeing at that polling location that you're at, they can go ahead and start contacting the local elections office and start talking with the appropriate people to make sure that that is taken care of. Not only that, but you're also helping report things because you may know to call somebody, but people may just take it for face value and say, okay, well, then I guess I'm just not going to vote because I'm never going to have that, or I'm not going to be able to meet that criteria. So those are some of the things that it is that you can do. Just be prepared. And also, you know, when going, if possible, if you have the opportunity, take a printed sample ballot already pre-filled out. For the most part, they don't necessarily let you with your phone, but if you have something printed, you're able to take that. So I would say those are some of the steps that you can take if you find yourself that you're being challenged at the polls. When it comes to ID, at least, you can also definitely call our helpline. It's a helpline, and so a person may not always pick up in real time. We try to do it as much as possible on election day, but at least if it's with a hotline, we're usually working with all of our partners and we're there on those election protection hotlines and we're able to address them that way as well.
Good, thank you. And I just want to say, for any chapter leaders that are on the webinar today, like we are, like as far as LCLAA, we're using VoteRiders ID cards for Pennsylvania. We requested them for Michigan. We have them for Georgia as well. But if there's any chapters that may want to use them as you're doing your programs, whether it's canvassing or just any events, like Selena said, you know, reach out to them, or you can email Bridget as well, and we'll help you put in the order for your specific organization. So please let us know. Additionally, Selena, I know that you guys do more webinars, like more specific to like states, right, that have ID laws. Are you guys available if somebody wants to do a webinar just for their state?
Yes, as I had mentioned, presentations and training, we're more than happy to do, whether it's a broad scope like this one, or if you really want to dig into your state's voter ID law and some of the resources, things that you can use in your state. We're more than happy to do that. I do want to say, I just realized that I'm not able to send my email to everyone through the chat, but the presentation will be sent out with some links. And so if you all want to include my email address there, that'll be great.
Yes. Yes, we'll send that out. We'll share the presentation, and if somebody wants to coordinate a webinar, we're happy to help connect you with them as well. Now I'm just going to pass it on to our team for closing.
I'm gonna start. So thank you, Selene, for this information. And thank you for everybody that joined us to this webinar. We just wanted to remind you, like, let's help other vecinos, amigos, family that they don't know how to register, that they don't know how to do on election day. That why it's important that we have to participate. So let's help them. If you need help, let's contact LCLAA and other organizations that are helping the community on this issue, on this matter.
Yeah, and actually, I just wanted to add, I did have a question. I know you mentioned the effects that this will have on a lot of BIPOC people. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the impacts that it will have on that voting ID laws currently have on Latino voters, because I noticed that was also another demographic that you touched on. If you could go more in depth.
Yes, when it comes to Latino voters, we see that there's still obstacles. They may be a little bit different. Something that we found in the study that I could attest to is the name, right, being significantly similar enough. And it's happened to me in the past where they didn't let me vote because I have two last names, and it didn't have, the local elections office didn't include my second last name. And so I definitely see that a lot. When it comes to Latino voters, also, we may be less likely to, again, have our current address and name, right? That it's the same as the voter registration. When it comes to the address, I think just being very careful, especially young Latinos being a little bit more mobile. You may be going from apartment to apartment when your lease is up. So just making sure that you have something a little bit more stable, maybe your parents' address, something like that. Something else that we've seen is, Latinos tend to be new citizens a lot more, right? And especially at a later age. And something that like I said, that I mentioned briefly is making sure, especially in some states like in Arizona and Texas, where it seems like people want to purge voters off the voting rolls. So it's important that if you become a U.S. citizen, that you go and you update and getting your identification, your state ID, or your driver's license with your new documentation. So with your naturalization certificate, with your social security card, your new social security card. So then you're not listed as an voter or maybe seeing obstacles once you're trying to either register to vote or when you're trying to vote at the polls, because unfortunately that's something that we have seen that could be a challenge, and especially if you're voting on election day, right? What can you do? Like, it's either you do it that day or you don't, which is another reason why I encourage people to do early voting if they can, because if there's some type of issue with your ID, then you're going to have time to maybe go back, get whatever it is that you need, or get that taken care of and still cast a regular ballot. So those are some of the additional things. Again, Latinos are less likely to have an acceptable identification to vote as well. And this is on a national level. We are also doing some surveys in Texas and in Georgia where there is an oversample of Latino and Black voters. And we do anticipate having some interesting findings when it comes to those demographics. But one of the biggest things, again, that we see is that when it comes to age as well, younger voters tend to be the most confused about voter ID laws. And age seems to be the strongest predictor as to whether or not they're going to have a current ID or driver's license with their current name and address on it. So combining that, I think that reaching out to Latino youth, it should definitely be a priority in that sense, because it seems that when you're looking at intersections, they seem to be that population that are least likely to have that ID to vote. And so, or be so confused that they may not even show up. So yeah, those are some of the things that we have found. And again, we're using that as kind of like a guide for us to see what we really need to focus on. And I do want to say that in this study that we did it in English and in Spanish. So this includes respondents that are primarily Spanish-speaking voters.
Thank you for that response. And sorry, I just came up with another question. I was wondering if you could talk more on, I know this was more general and like looking at voter ID more generally, but I was wondering if you could go more in depth to, are there particular states that VoteRiders is very focused on, that are having more aggressive voting ID laws that you guys are trying to really, push, that people are educated on voting ID laws?
I mean, we're concerned about all the states that have voter ID laws, but yes, there are some. And just to give you an example as to what it is that we tried to do back in 2023, in January of 2023, Ohio had a pretty relaxed voter ID law, but they went from having one of the most flexible to having one of, if not the most strict voter ID law in the nation. And we didn't have a presence there. And so we really had to reevaluate, because when we have staff or when we deploy resources, we're not just going to do it for an election cycle. We're going to have a permanent presence because we know that there's going to be like impact that we can do there long term. And so we actually hired a team in Ohio. So that is one of the states. Another state is, for example, North Carolina. North Carolina had their voter ID law in litigation for years, but this is actually not only the first presidential, but the first federal election where they're going to have a voter ID law. And so a lot of people don't know that. And other ones that we are keeping an eye out, and I'm not just mentioning these because these are exclusively the ones that we're focusing on, but I do want to give just some examples of the different scenarios and why we're looking at some states more than others. Another one that is very concerning is Arizona, for instance, because now they're wanting proof of citizenship when registering people to vote. And unfortunately, we're seeing this trend more and more, and it's concerning because back in 2012, we saw voter ID laws. People maybe didn't think it was a big deal. And now look, most states have them, 38 out of 50. And we don't want that to happen when it comes to voter registration. So proof of citizenship for that is also very concerning. We actually added that. I didn't have it here, but when it comes to the study, we ask, like, do you have something readily available to prove your citizenship, your birth certificate, your naturalization certificate? And people, if you had to show it tomorrow, and not many, not everybody's able to do that, but just because you're not able to do that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be eligible to vote if you're a US citizen. So yeah, those are just some things, and just different reasons, right? In Texas, yes, there's alternatives like signing the affidavit, but something that I mentioned is they don't accept student IDs at all, yet a lot of their polling locations are on college campuses, right? So that creates a different type of confusion there. Or like in Georgia, where they only accept student IDs of some college campuses, only if it's a public one, but not all of them, but yet you may have them as polling locations. So I think that every state has its intricacies, but these are just some as to why we're on these states. I know that I was able to mention them, that a lot of these, if not all of them, probably have staff on the ground, but this is the reason why, because we're starting to see that those are very specific trends that if they continue the wrong way, it could really impact even further, especially just the BIPOC community.
Yeah, and are there any like legislations that we can follow that might help to get rid of or make sure that there are less voter ID laws that you guys are tracking more generally, if that makes sense?
Yes. I mean, usually because voter ID laws are state-based, when your state leg session is happening, I would just encourage you to look out to see if there's any. I know that, for example, in Michigan, they are having a legislation where it's actually proactive and trying to expand access and eliminate barriers, right? So when it comes to voter ID, if there isn't something to completely eliminate it, at a minimum, look for legislation that is looking to expand the list of acceptable identifications, and kind of going that route. I can't say specific ones necessarily right now, but once the legislative session happens, that is something that we'll have a closer pulse on the ground on, and we would love to, if you all are looking for legislation to really pay attention to when it comes to voter ID, would love to stay in touch with you all, so then we can get that going as well.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask one last question, promise. And I'll just give the opportunity for anyone who still has any lingering questions to drop your question in the Q&A as we're wrapping up. But just to finish, I know the Brennan Center, as you mentioned, and VoteRiders has done a lot of work to shed light on voter ID laws. And I was just wondering if you could talk more about, you talked about how VoteRiders was founded. Can you talk more about suppression, voter suppression, and like how historically, Latinos perhaps have been, and other communities of color have been impacted or have been targeted specifically?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I mentioned in my presentation, no surprise, right? When I talked about the people that are most impacted, because it doesn't matter whether it's voter registration, ID laws, whatever it may be, it seems like we're just getting attacked through so many different angles, right? For me, I feel like it's even starting with like administrative racism when it comes to even the ID issuing office, going from you are providing a service to we're trying to catch you in a lie, like you need to give us the information and the documents that you need to show that you are who you are. So I think that in all aspects, when it comes to voting, when it comes to these policies, it's a culmination of a lot of different things, different policies, different legislation that we see that are impacting us in different aspects of our lives. But in voting, I mean, it's the same thing, right? Like when it comes to voter ID, you're starting to see that, hey, why is it that in some states you can't use your student ID to vote because they say that it's quote unquote to prevent voter fraud, which by the way, there's no evidence at all that there's voter fraud to begin with. So the whole reason as to why voter ID laws are implemented, like there's no foundation for it to begin with, right? But if that is the reason, how are you telling me that a college is trusted enough to be a polling location, but it's not trusted enough to where you can accept their identification, that they're proving who they are, right? But yet in that same state, you can use your handgun license, right? So it's blatantly showing us that it's just creating a barrier, right? And we know that, again, the accepted identifications across the board in all of the states is that state's identification and driver's license. But that takes money, that takes time off of work, sometimes a full day off of work. It takes documents that, to be quite honest, sometimes our staff get frustrated because it's a loop, right? They say, okay, you need a copy of your birth certificate, but for a copy of your birth certificate, you need an ID, but that's why you need the copy of your birth certificate to get an ID to begin with. And so it could be very overwhelming. And especially, I mean, Latinos, right? Even born here, maybe your first, second generation, maybe you don't know the bureaucratic process of the administrative and the institutions that we have here, like the processes that they have. And so it could be very overwhelming to where you get frustrated and you just give up. And if you just give up, you don't get the identification, whatever it may be, then you're seeing that in return, you don't have what you need to go vote to be able to fight for your community, to make things more accessible, more equitable. And so it's kind of like a loop. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is just another thing that is added to create obstacles and to suppress the vote. But it does, I do want to say, like, this is the beginning of it. Like, us voting is the beginning, because we also need to follow up with accountability. We need to follow up with being just active to make sure that people are actually advocating for our communities and for what it is that is going to better us and provide us that racial equity at the end of the day.
Well, I think that's a great way to close. Thank you again to Selene and VoteRiders for your amazing presentation and to everyone's thoughtful questions. I personally learned a lot about voter ID laws and how they'll impact people who look like us during this election season. I welcome all of you today to stay in touch with us and take a picture of this slide if you need to. You can stay in touch with LCLAA by following us at LCLAA, visiting our website to learn more about how we're working to mobilize voters through our Empower 2024 campaign, or you can email us, the email is there, to be added to our email listserv. And our listserv is where we actively share updates on what our organization is doing. And I highly encourage all of you to email us to request to be added to this listserv, because this is also where we're going to be sharing more details on our canvassing efforts to encourage the Latino vote and make a difference. And we would love for all of you guys to get involved. So thank you so much.